Hello, my name is Greg Madison, and this is The Living Process. On this episode, my guest is Adrian Harris. Adrian is a UK ecotherapist and focusing oriented therapist. And in this episode, we talk about a lot of different things, partly about what ecotherapy is, what ecopsychology is, and different ways in which the implicit somatic aspect of those practices or sensitivities fit so well with focusing, and how focusing can be integrated into the eco movement and ecopaganism as well, and also how the nature sensitivity can be brought into focusing and perhaps expand what focusing can be for us and how we understand interaction in focusing and how focusing oriented therapy maybe can take more explicit account of the natural world. I found it a fascinating discussion, and we will put a lot of different links and references in the show notes so that you can find out about Adrian's work and a little bit more about the background of ecopsychology and ecotherapy. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Adrian Harris and ecotherapy and focusing. Okay, so welcome back to The Living Process, and my guest this time is Adrian Harris. Welcome, Adrian. It's nice to see you.
Thank you, Greg. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while. Um, the first thing I want to say is just I'm noticing, ironically, that the day I'm talking to you, I have to have my blinds down, so I'm cutting off my access to nature, which I normally have in this room. Um,
Oh yeah, okay.
and yeah, it
Um,
makes a difference. But what I'd like to ask you about, first of all, is I know that you practice focusing, and I know you do more than that. So I'd be curious to hear about your journey into focusing and maybe other practices as well that you're involved in.
yeah. So, as you might expect, given the topic, there's quite a bit of weaving between focusing and nature connection and ecotherapy over the whole of my experience with this.
Hmm.
So I came in to focusing. I was doing a PhD um, back in early 2000s. And the topic of it was embodied knowing,
Hmm.
right? So immediately like, oh, okay, that's sensible focusing
Yep.
in eco-pagans, which is a particular it's environmental activists who are identified as pagans. But the key thing for our purposes is the embodied knowing piece. And I'm doing this PhD trying to find out about embodied knowing. And somebody said to me, so how are you gonna access this wordless, tacit knowing that people can't talk about? How are you? I was like, that's a great question. And I was looking around trying to find some way in, and then I came across this thing called focusing. I was like, wait a minute, is this could be it? And as just to cut a long story short, it absolutely was, and I created a methodology based on it, and it became part of my practice. So that was my way in, needing to find some way of articulating, making sense of, accessing embodied knowing, and
Mhm.
focusing was perfect for that.
So
Um,
the interest in environmentalism, eco-paganism, that kind of stuff, that was there already for you, and focusing came into that.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Can you say just, I mean, I'm curious, imagine other people would be, could you say a little bit about eco-paganism? In what way, what's the
Yeah.
pagan part of it?
So there are so paganism itself is an earth-based
Mhm.
approach. It's neo-paganism, so it's something new that um we've kind of developed or reinvented or rediscovered, if you like. And within that, there's certain people for whom it would be, well, look, the earth is under threat. There's environmental challenges all over the place. If I am someone who honors and worships the earth, then I'm called to defend and
Mhm.
become involved in environmental activism. So not all pagans, probably more now than there were, but there are particular groups of people who identify as pagans and they're environmental activists. So
Mhm.
they're out there on the front line. Um, Back in the day, back in the 90s when the road protest movements were happening, especially in the UK, sitting in trees, climbing on diggers, digging, living in holes underground to stop.
Mhm.
So people who are environmental activists and are pagans,
Mhm.
they are eco-pagans.
Yeah, I can certainly see um, a seamless line towards activism because if your deep connection is to the earth, you would want to be protective of that connection and that, I don't know if it's an object, that subject that you're in connection with.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I identify as an eco-pagan. So when I was coming in, my interest in what led me to doing the PhD was experiences as an eco-pagan of, oh, I know something here. I know well, I'm putting my hand on my chest. I know something here,
Mhm.
and it's not here. It's different.
Yeah.
It's bodied, or
Yeah.
as I called it earlier, a somatic knowing.
Yeah.
But I couldn't articulate it, couldn't quite say what it was. And then, of course, focusing comes in, and there's this whole field of work about connecting with this feeling, and I'm being allow it to articulate, and all of that suddenly opens up, and there I am in the world of focusing.
Yeah, I mean, the way you describe it, I can see how finding focusing maybe gave you more language for the knowing that you were already accessing in some way.
Yes,
Um, and having read your paper, I'm also curious the other way around, how the nature sensitivity, the paganism informs focusing.
that's so one of the things that I found from doing the research.
Mhm.
So I'm on the ground, living on road protest sites, interviewing eco-pagans. What came up really, really often was that they were able to access this
Mhm.
and to some at least access it and were had an awareness of it and sometimes maybe articulate it. So I believe from the research, a lot of probably all of the people I interviewed have do focusing, but they don't call it that.
Yeah.
Some of them had a name for it, they'd call it something else from a different tradition, but nobody called it focusing because they hadn't come across it. So it was a real way of enabling us
Mhm.
to connect with the other than human world through the body and to have that connection, that dialogue with the other than human.
That's interesting to me that it's through the body that you get that connection to the other than human.
That is absolutely my belief that it is the body is the the way in which I, I think part of the problem in the current context, especially with environmentalism, is it often is very, very cerebral. It's like, okay, we need the facts and the figures of climate change are this, this, and this. This is a terrible thing. We must do something. I'm like, yes, absolutely, we must, but that's not going to crack it. That's not, but it isn't. That's not actually making a difference. But if we can connect here, get that knowledge here, connect with the other than human here, then things start happening. Then the juice starts flowing. Then the passion comes,
Hmm.
and then the change comes. So
Hmm.
for me, the whole thing is very bound up with
Yeah.
ecotherapy and environmental activism and how we can bring about change.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say, as you're describing that, that also then the grief comes up.
Yes, yes. And this is something that I'm glad you brought that in because it's a concern of mine and some of those others I've been talking to around this. I'm going to be starting to lead workshops, inviting people to, through focusing, to come into touch with this. One of the things that's going to come up is environmental grief.
Mhm.
They may not have articulated, may have just kind of pushed it away or not looked at it, but it's going to come up. And there's a real sense in me, there's a responsibility here. If I'm going to allow them to access that, I need to also be there to facilitate the process
Mhm.
of grieving that could well come up. So there's a challenge. There's a challenge there. That's a bit of an edge for me of how am I going to responsibly facilitate that
Yeah.
going forwards?
Yeah, I think um, that sounds so important because I could imagine that for some people, and I'm thinking perhaps this is my experience at times, the grief of the loss of the natural world and the kind of just witnessing the way it's treated, that it is so overwhelming that disconnection is the
Yes.
kind of response,
Yeah.
is to just kind of look away, sort of distract yourself, pretend it's not happening. It is so pervasive that it seems like it's too big a problem. I can't do anything about it, so I don't want to even feel it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The upside, of course, is that focusing is a fantastic resource for working with grief.
Yeah.
So that's the two of them are beautifully kind of going together. We're not only focusing will facilitate your access to this connection with the other than human. If the grief comes up, which we think it might, then we can also go, okay, well, you've learned a tool here,
Hmm.
be with that
Hmm.
and allow it to move forwards in a way that can be productive.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that just sounds so crucial to me. You've mentioned, and again, I'm thinking a little bit of your paper, but you've mentioned ecotherapy. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So something called ecopsychology emerged in sort of like the 60s. And ecopsychology kind of broadly being an acceptance of the fact that we are not completely enclosed. Psychology conventionally quite, it's about what's going on in this human being and how they relate to that human being. Ecopsychology is acknowledging the fact that we are part of an ecosystem. We've spent almost all of our evolution living close to the other than human, and that is a massive part of how we make sense of the world. So eco psychology was bringing in that whole field of recognition of there's an environment we're part of, there's a natural environment we are intrinsically bound up with, and that has various strands to it, which I won't unpack too much. But from that, then there was then a kind of a subgroup, if you like, or a kind of a outgrowth of that. Well, given that we've got this psychology of this, how does that how does that apply to mental health? And what strategies, approaches that are informed by that that can help? And there we got ecotherapy.
So let me just say that back to you because I feel like I can feel there's more in this that I'm curious about. um, the eco psychology, it was a development within psychology that acknowledged that we aren't just separate subjectivities, and psychology isn't just about what happens inside of one isolated individual, because psychology can be quite individualistic, certainly
Mm,
was, and probably still is. Instead, it acknowledges that that's never quite been the case, that all through evolution, we have been in this kind of intimate contact with a whole environment, an ecosystem around us. And if we want to understand the individual, whatever an individual
mm.
is, we have to take that broader perspective. Is that right?
Yes, very broadly. And within that, the early discussions around that looked at things like addiction to um, the current culture.
Okay.
There's a lovely paper in one of the first book that's talking about uh, um, I'm an addict to Western civilization. In the sense that in some way we need to work with that and get back in touch with something more healthy. Other articles talking about the way that spending time, extended time in nature, profoundly shifts our consciousness in ways that are reveal our interconnectedness in ways we might call spiritual. So a whole number of different perspectives within ecopsychology, but of which those are just two short
Yeah.
examples.
Both of those are fascinating. To think of, which I love that idea, to think of um, the way that we live in the West is actually an addiction to a particular culture. That is fascinating because it is so global. It's very inclusive of our way of living. It's not just looking at, addiction to smartphones or this or that. It's actually the culture itself is a kind of addictive culture that we can't let go of. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's what it was at one woman called cellist Glendinning, I think is the name. And the I can send you the reference to the book. It's the Roszak. It's the first book on eco psychology, edited by Theodore Roszak.
We can maybe put that in the show notes in case people.
Yeah, put it in the show notes. So I can give you the link, and you go and look at it. It is the book that kicked off the whole eco psychology field.
Wow.
It's an edited collection of some absolutely seminal texts that, well, I certainly am still referring to now, and it's just one of those in there. Is this sense? So do I think that's true? I think to some extent, there's some. It feels like a slight oversimplification to use the addiction model, but there's definitely something in there.
Hmm.
We are tied in to the way
Hmm.
we are in this Western culture, and there's elements of it that are deeply dysfunctional.
Yeah. For me, the word addiction it doesn't matter so much in the way you were describing it. I mean, I could replace it with obsessed or a compulsion with or whatever. But the thing that feels subtly exciting to me is that it's taking the whole picture and saying, hold on a second, there's something about this whole picture and your attachment to it that isn't the only way it can be. That feels
Yeah,
there's an opening there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's huge. I think from there's a tendency. within the whole of our culture, and we can call it Western culture or whatever we like, whatever term we want to use, that this is how it is. Almost like, oh yeah, we've always lived like this. Is
Yeah, exactly.
just this is just how it's supposed to be. And then I've been consciously spending time looking at indigenous cultures and meeting up with indigenous peoples and talking to them. And then you're going, whoa, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Not only is there another way, it's a way that's been around way longer.
Mhm.
It's sustainable because it hasn't changed for thousands of years. And oh my goodness, it hasn't destroyed the environment that it's based in either in all that time. And it appears to be largely beneficial for the
Mhm.
humans that live within that. If they're left to their own devices, they don't have too much input from outside. There's a sense that they're pretty much doing okay. I don't want to romanticize it, but there is this sense of there's something there for us to learn from that could have huge value.
Yeah, I'm glad that you just acknowledge we don't want to over romanticize because I think we can do that
Yeah.
sometimes. But it sounds like this is what goes back to the second point you were making, that there's something about living in that way in the natural environment that has an impact on our consciousness. I'm curious about that. Can you say anything more about that?
Well, the particular paper if we start there, because it was absolutely, I think seminal actually came in PhD quite significantly. A guy called Robert Greenaway, he's American. He was working in a university, and he had access. They could get out into big proper wilderness, like big spaces.
Mm.
And he started taking students out on multi-day excursions, like trekking for like 3, 4, 5 days. And what he found was that after about 3 days, and 3 days is an interesting number because it's come up in other places. The first 3 days, they might be like, "Oh my God, it's too hot. I'm missing my home comforts. I don't like this very much." Day three, something shifted, and they suddenly were like, "Oh, they really arrived."
Mhm.
The degree of connection between the individuals improved. Their dreams became richer.
Mm.
Some of them had spiritual, kind of like a sense of a spiritual awakening, almost like a sense of real connection to the place that wasn't there before. Some people recovered from addiction during this process. A whole number of different, really very significant shifts happened. And Rob, he one of the things he says in the book is he realized that civilization is only 3 days deep.
It only needs a 3-day detox.
3 day detox, and then something happens that's quite significant.
Wow.
The other interesting piece is so they had these quite significant shifts.
Yeah.
The problem is when they came back, they re-enter the place where they were before. A lot of them had a really hard time. It was like, oh my God, I can't sleep properly. It's too noisy. People don't quite get what I'm talking about. They don't quite understand what this meant for me. I'm feeling a bit depressed or anxious or all sorts of stuff on the return. And they had, over time, he realized they needed to build in kind of an easing back in. So it would be, okay, we're going to go back in now. Just take care of yourself, and if you can get out into nature, do. And you might want to pick up your yoga practice or start one if you haven't got it. You might want to keep on your diet and stay in touch with the rest of the people that you went on the journey with. So lots of support wasn't required to help people to reintegrate back in again. So
And it reminds me a little bit of kind of coming down from a psychedelic trip and how that you need to do that sort of carefully. But even using that analogy further, did people find once they reintegrated back into their lives that they were able to hold on to some of what had happened for them?
yeah, if I think the psychedelic and parallel, I would call it, is really valuable. They were able to, if they're allowed to integrate it, as with the psychedelic experience, if you integrate it, then you can bring those valuable changes into your life, into the rest of your life. So yeah, so the potential hugely beneficial, but unfortunately, we haven't all got access to going off for a week in the Rockies or wherever it might be. That's that's not accessible to most of us. So the principle's fantastic. He calls it the wilderness effect.
Yeah. So is that where ecotherapy comes in?
It's one of the pieces in ecotherapy. Ecotherapy is so worth highlighting, both ecopsychology and ecotherapy, very broad
Hmm.
church.
Hmm.
And at one end, you've got a fairly classical psychology, um, very qualitative. We've used this specific intervention with this specific group, and this is what happened.
Hmm.
Very much in the old classical tradition. And then at the other end, you've got more shamanic or shamanistic influenced, animist, and they're all within there. So that to give you a bigger picture of it's a big area and it's developing. So within ecotherapy, I would use ways of bringing in the wilderness effect or something like it, much reduced, in a local park.
Okay.
And the way that I would do that is because I haven't got the extraordinary expanse. I haven't got the kind of that level of awesomeness.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to use specific in mindfulness and maybe some focusing or sensory awareness to crank it up so we can look at that tiny little leaf or that tiny little plant and really pull out. Oh my God, when I look at that with a magnifying glass, that flower is wow, it's amazing. Yeah, you're pulling the ore out.
Mm.
And I love that. I love that Blake line. See a world in a grain of sand and
Hmm.
heaven in a wild flower. That kind of gets it for me. Is I'm trying to facilitate in people the capacity for awe that they might have got if they were in the Grand Canyon for 3 days. Something accessing that in their local park by pulling out their curiosity and
Yeah.
turning up their presence of mind and really bringing in their awareness of how unbelievably awesome even the tiniest
Yeah.
plant is.
That's amazing. When you describe that, it makes me think that the deeper you get into the detail of the specific, some specific instance of something, the more you also access the universal.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if it is something like that that happens, that people open up to the whole of nature by looking at in such detail at the beauty of a flower or leaf.
Yeah, yeah. It's opening the doorway, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Opening that, and it's an embodied experience.
Hmm. Yeah, I certainly, as I listen to you, I really feel a resonance to what you're describing.
Mm.
Um, I'm wondering, wondering a couple of things, but one is just sort of how do people carry forward with that? Like after a session or uh, a group session or whatever it is with like this, how do they, how does a person keep that alive, keep access to it alive, keep it sort of present bodily in some way?
Yeah, that's such a crucial question. I used to run, well, it's something that I've kind of occurred to me over time because I used to run sessions, nature connection sessions in London when I lived there, and people would go, "Oh, wow, that was fantastic," and then you, it's like 6 months later they've probably forgotten it. So now over time, I've now developed what I call the three keys of nature connection, and my intention in the workshops I do now is you're going to hopefully have a really lovely experience here with the experiences I'm going to facilitate for you. And you're going to learn some techniques that you can take to your local park and do them yourself. So it's not like you need me there to facilitate you because
Mm.
I'm the nature connection guy. No, no. It's part of your humanness. It's part of your birthright as a human animal to recognize your connectedness with nature.
Hmm.
Nature connection is a reality. We've just forgotten it. So giving them back that, giving them a taste of it, and then saying, and the techniques I've taught you today, just pick a couple of them and go and do them in your local park. So I'm building in now much more of a ongoing support with I've got videos and things showing people the techniques
Okay.
to keep because otherwise it's not pointless, but otherwise it's somewhat I'm sure all of us have been on workshops and you go, oh my God, it was amazing. And then like 6 months later, you've forgotten all about it rather than
Yeah.
making it part of your life.
Yeah, I'm imagining that the experiences you're talking about, though deeply impactful, they could quite quickly just get paved over
Yeah.
by, the regular life that people are living.
Yeah.
Could you tell us, I mean, you mentioned focusing, you mentioned mindfulness. Can you just tell us a little bit of how you encourage people to keep it alive afterwards? What are the kind of techniques or skills that you encourage?
Well, I'll share the three keys
Yeah,
because they've come to me. It was years and years I've been doing this stuff and teaching it, and suddenly I was just out for a walk. I went, hang on a minute, there's basically number one, slow down. Oh yeah, cool. You have to slow down. You're not going to get any kind of nature connection unless you slow down a bit.
hmm.
So some mindfulness, some slower walking, just what in whatever way, bit of slow breathing, slow down. Number two, use all your senses, which when on the workshop, we start off, we do some work with different ways of seeing, hearing, and then we'll move on to smell and touch. And then if there's a longer workshop and time, we'll do some interoception. And that can lead into some touching into focusing.
Hmm.
So that's the second key, use all your senses. And the third one is get curious. So from that space, you've slowed down and you opened your senses up, and it's like, well, what's that? What's that over there? How does that feel? How does that smell? Oh, is that color, is that green the same as that green or no? It isn't. It's not. So then you're engaging.
Hmm.
And my current belief is those three keys, which are super simple, and I can tell people like bang, bang, bang,
Hmm.
will be sufficient. So if you've got the three keys, remember the three keys, and you've got an exercise associated with each of them.
Hmm.
Go in your local park, slow down,
Hmm.
open your senses, and get curious. I almost guarantee you're going to be there.
That's really helpful. And as I'm listening to you, it reminds me of the process of phenomenology. It sounds very phenomenological. And then a part of it is when you say use all your senses, I'm thinking, well, that's also letting go of your assumptions. In order to use your senses, you can't approach a flower, just telling yourself the name of it, how often it needs to be watered, all that kind of stuff. You need to approach it using all of your senses, being open to it as it is in some way.
Totally. Yeah, that's great. I hadn't realized that, yes, it is. It's kind of a phenomenological process, isn't it? It's exactly a parallel there of, and then
Yeah,
the curiosity of
yeah,
you're bracketing off. What do I already know? Forget
exactly.
everything you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It sounds very, very much like the phenomenological process.
Mhm.
Um, I'm also curious, just looking at time, I'm curious what I said earlier, kind of at about the other side of it. Um, because we've been talking a little bit about how focusing or embodiment or somatic awareness of some kind can enhance this palpable connection with nature. I'm curious about the other side as well, where focusing people, what do they well, what I'm tempted to say is what do they realize about what focusing is if they begin to use it in nature, like walking outside or sitting in the park or in the woods or whatever?
Yeah, I think this is a huge question, and to be honest, I feel like we're very much exploring
Hmm.
because sometimes, I mean, there's a group of us that have been talking about this for a few months, who are involved with focusing and interested in this way of developing it. There's sometimes I think, well, this is so different from conventional focusing. Sometimes it's almost kind of making it quite complicated. What is this? Is this focusing in nature or focusing with nature or focusing with nature as a partner? So ways we might approach it. So I've got some ways that we might frame it. So when I wrote the initial paper,
Mm.
the people I was the focusing people I was talking to were walking in nature and focusing with a partner, and then aspects of the natural world, maybe a tree or a bush or some natural part of the natural environment would almost be a symbol that would
Mm.
prompt a felt sense, and they would respond to that.
Mhm.
In one case, somebody they were walking and came across a tree had fallen down in front of the on the path, and they had to kind of scramble over the tree, and it was like there's this barrier in the way. And then she got over the tree and was like walking. Whoa, hold on, that's brought up this barrier in my own life
Yeah.
that I didn't know quite how to bring in. And there it was symbolized in nature. And then her focusing process was prompted. So that's how uh, people who are familiar with focusing and bring it into an outdoor natural space. That tends to be the way that it works.
So that's like nature as a symbolizing process that assists the carrying forward.
That I think that's the best way to think about it. It's that yes, that it is that, and nature is a holding space as well. So that's kind of makes it a good space to be with all of that. But
Mm.
yes, there's in some way it's nature is a catalyst or a
Mhm.
prompt or prompts a felt sense that is relevant to them in some way and acts as a symbol.
Yeah. How about other ways? What else?
So the other aspect that is interesting is the and this again came up in the paper. Some people would be out in nature focusing, and there'd be a sense of am I the focuser or am I the partner? Because it feels like this tree I'm with, this isn't just a symbol. There is an entity here, and there's some kind of relationship between me and this entity that I'm accessing through my focusing through the body. And that then brings in a whole nother dimension of, well, the animist framework comes in and makes sense of that. But then that's some people would go, well, that's weird, or that can't be right, or that's problematic. Other people say, well, yeah, absolutely, of course, the other than human world has sentience or has capacity as a being. And I could focus with a tree just the same way I could focus with you. Well, it would be different, but there's a parallel there. So that's another level.
Mhm.
The third one that's worth noting that we might also I explore a little bit is when we are in the natural space and we're drop into the body in a focusing way, then the self-other boundary can get quite blurred.
Yeah.
And there's something spiritual can come up, and that's come up for a few people. One of the people I mentioned in the paper I wrote, but well, with the eco-pagans I was talking to, especially, as Gendlin said, the body isn't. It's not a. We're not skin encapsulated. We extend, and when we
Mm.
can sense into that in a natural environment, then something can happen where something quite mystical
Yeah.
potentially can
Yeah.
come in. So that's another. So there's different levels of this.
Hmm.
Each one has its own little nuances.
Hmm.
So we're exploring, but there's lots, as you can see. It's an area of to be explored and expanded.
So let me say back a little bit about the second and the third. The first, I understand that. I don't know if I've had that experience. Maybe I have, but maybe didn't make that much out of it. But the second, focusing with the tree, um, what it brings up in me is the sense that, I mean, I used to live on the edge of a large wood, and 3 or 4 times a day, because I've got a dog, I would be out in those woods. I was out in them constantly, the dog and me. Um, so that's the memory that's coming to me as I listen to you. And the me in the tree thing, it for me, the sense sometimes is it's almost as though there's something in the tree that wants to be known. And just like with a listener, it's like there's something there that I mean, as a focuser, there's something there as the listener that I'm tuning into, something in the focuser that wants to be known. It feels like that with the tree, as though I have some responsibility to it's too it sounds a little too far-fetched maybe to say, but almost to carry a message from the tree. Uh, and I don't know about that exactly, but certainly there is a felt sense that there is a connection between the beingness of the tree and my felt sense that somehow I'm picking up something from the tree. The third example, certainly my experience would be in the woods, in particular parts of the woods at least. If I really let my attention down into my body, which I would often do when I'm walking in the woods, it does feel as though my distinction from the woods disintegrates, not, well, disintegrates to a large extent. I mean, I'm still walking, I still have feet and legs and everything, and my felt sense doesn't disappear, but the boundary of my body as the boundary of my experience, that does change. It feels very much like the leaves and the trees and the meadows and everything around me, that becomes my larger body. It doesn't totally replace the smaller body I'm used to, but it it does expand it. It does something. Is that what you're describing?
But you described it beautifully. And it's lovely to hear you speak about your experience because of and you put it really well. That is exactly what it is. It's like, okay, so it's not something that somebody comes, oh well, Adrian, you're this eco-pagan guy. You've been doing these rituals in nature and you're an animist, and of course you're going to get these weird kind of. No, no, it's not me. It's I am a human mammal who is evolved to be in nature, and there is something that happens can happen to any other human mammal if they allow themselves just to be available to that.
Yes. And it makes me also wonder a little bit, going back to the thing you were saying a long time ago about addiction to the Western culture.
Mm.
Um, what you're saying now, it makes me wonder, we do so much focusing in little rooms and offices or, inside spaces. And how much of that is having an impact on what comes up? I mean, are we kind of focusing within a particular culture that already is quite confining? And because certainly my experience when I focus outside, it feels very distinctly different from if I'm focusing in my office. I'm wondering what you think about that, if the four walls focusing is maybe too restrictive somehow.
Yeah, what's immediately coming to mind is my ecotherapy
Hmm.
practice. So some of the time, there's an availability for people to be with me outdoors. So we'll be in the park, walking or sitting, doing therapeutic work.
Hmm.
And it's very, very different in lots of ways from when we're sitting in my therapy room,
Yeah,
indoors, nice sofa,
yeah.
doing the therapy. It's very different. So my initial sense is there is something wherever we do focusing
Hmm.
is going to have an impact.
Hmm.
It,
Hmm.
it must inevitably, given the nature of what we understand about the body and
Yeah,
how focusing works and the whole interaction is everything, all of that,
yeah,
inevitably, if you're sitting in a room, it's going to have a different,
yeah,
it's going to have an impact. And what that is, how much, how much that is good or how much that is not helpful,
yeah.
I don't know. We that's to be explored. I mean, but maybe.
But it's interesting to me because, I mean, you reference this in your paper, which I was surprised by. You're kind of talking about Gendlin's interaction first, the body environment sort of model that we aren't enclosed within just the skin envelope sort of thing. Um, and that person-centered practice is challenged by that, which surprised me. I'm an existential therapist, and existentially, the intersubjective is kind of what we take as the given. So that's the first thing I wanted to say is I hadn't realized that the person-centered world, at least some of it,
Some of
mainstream.
it.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
pointed out some exceptions, um, but that some of it still is quite sort of subject to subject, sort of an assumption of that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the more important thing I think I want to say is in FOT, focusing oriented therapy, when we talk about interaction first, we're normally mostly interested in the impact that the therapist has on the client and vice versa, as though the felt sensing process is just between these two people.
Mm.
And who do I become with this client? It says something about me, something about the client. Blah, blah. We get very enamored with that part of the interaction, rightly so. But what you're talking about now makes me think, hold on a second. How about the rest of the interaction? How often do we broaden our awareness and consciousness to the fact we're sitting in a room rather than in the woods? Or, the interaction of everything that happened just before the person arrived and just before I arrived and the world outside of the room. I mean, maybe we need to broaden what we're interested in the interaction.
Yeah. I
What do you
think
think
that's
about
right.
that? Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it almost sounds like you're bringing eco psychology framing of because eco psychology it's not just me and my therapist in this room.
Hmm.
It's, well, you have a dog
Yes.
that will be might be something that I would bring into the if I've got an ecotherapy frame, might be, oh, have you got pets? Oh, yeah, I've got a dog. And how is your relationship with your dog? Oh, it's like this, and we go into the woods together. And how is that going into the woods together with your dog?
Hmm.
There's a very, very significant relationship going on there, which
Definitely.
isn't always going to be brought up in a therapeutic
Hmm.
conversation.
Hmm.
So yeah, yes, absolutely. I think there's some juice here to think about what's going on outside the room and being more systematic about it.
Yes.
Is
Yes, and it makes me think as well how much of philosophy and psychology and psychotherapy evolves in city environments and is theorized in university buildings and places like that, and how much of that actually has an impact on how we understand things.
yeah, yeah. I was struck when I read in one of Plato's dialogues. I don't know which one it is. He's talking to. It might be the Phaedo. They're in Athens, and his colleague says, "Oh, I'm going to wander outside the city walls and go and sit in the trees." And Plato's like, "Why don't we bothering to do that for? Like, there's nothing nature. There's nothing out there for me, and there probably isn't for you either. But hey, that's what you want to do." And I'm parodying it a little bit, but it's in there. This sense of it's about this. It's about the polis. It's about the city. It's about this, the kind of, the enclosed, the cultural, not something you're going to go and do in nature. That's something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and that runs through until we get, uh, well, there's probably other precursors, but Merleau-Ponty comes in straight away as like my kind of
Hmm.
brilliant starting point of, no, actually, there's more, and the blue of the sky, I become immersed in the blue of the sky, and my phenomenological experience of nature is this.
Yeah, exactly.
And then Bateson,
Yes.
again, brilliant, steps it forward, and then Gendlin comes in again in that and in that thread of people who acknowledge we're moving beyond the skin bag, and what does that imply? Well, it implies a hell of a lot, but is normally in our culture just bracketed out. Just we don't even it's dismissed almost as being irrelevant for whatever reason.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me also of the deep ecology movement.
Oh,
Yeah. And I don't know if you came across a Norwegian Arne Næss.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew him briefly, and he gave me a book, let me borrow a book from him, written by, I can't remember who it was, a woman writer, an ecologist, who was talking about the beings of mountains.
Oh,
And I found it very, very evocative. I mean, he was such a mountain climber, and his ecology was very much in this kind of deep spiritual being level. Yeah.
yeah. Definitely a huge influence. And my sense is that what the sort of what's being explored in this nature-based focusing or focusing in nature or with nature is got something associated with deep ecology.
Hmm.
I did an interview last week with a friend and a guy called John Seed, who's been involved since the early days with experiential workshops with deep ecology. And there's a real sense of we're all on the same page here.
Hmm.
Yeah, this is what they're, and I've run deep ecology experiential workshops myself.
Okay.
What we're doing here it's all very closely related, and there's nuances and weavings going on here that are very subtle and powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm conscious of the time. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you would like us to discuss.
A quick.
Hmm. Or anything else that you're passionate about. And
Yeah, I think I'd want to name check um, Fisher, wrote a book called Radical Ecology, Radical Ecopsychology, and he talks specifically about Gendlin's work quite extensively in
okay.
the context of what of ecotherapy and ecopsychology. And he's talking about getting ecopsychology back to the roots. Where are the roots? And the roots are in the body, and references Gendlin and talks about how when he's doing focusing in nature, he gets this real sense of a communication with the raven speaks to him through his body. So there's some it's a juicy book if you want to pursue this sort of area. I just want to get him in there because he's yeah, he's an important writer in this particular field.
Yeah, it would be good if we maybe include that in the show notes so people can find his work.
Yeah.
So what I'm left with are kind of the two different angles of what we've been talking about. One is how focusing can be integrated into ecopsychology, ecotherapy, deep ecology, and is almost implicitly there anyway, but how knowing focusing gives you more of a palpable sense of how deep that can go and gives you ways of staying with it and not, ending up bouncing back into thoughts or assumptions or whatever on the one hand. On the other hand, what I find really interesting for me personally is how an ecological or environmental sensitivity immediately expands focusing. It feels to me like it gives focusing a much larger context as soon as we bring that in. That feels really fundamental to me. It feels like the body knows the earth and it knows the environment. It knows everything around it. It knows where it came from, so to speak. Um, and how much of that we may be holding it in abeyance, kind of, and not welcoming in quite because we don't explicitly acknowledge its importance.
Yeah. That we've because of, as we were saying, our culture tends just not to pay attention to that,
Exactly.
but historic reasons that go back a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that in our focusing, we can focus within the culture or we can focus on the culture and take a step back and see that just even the way we're living is something to focus on. It's not something to take for granted and to focus inside of that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is what I find very exciting for me about this particular way of working is it just expands off in all sorts of
Yeah.
directions that I hadn't expected.
Hmm.
When I first wrote the initial paper, it was like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, and this is kind of relevant to what I'm doing. And then there's recently been another paper published. Again, I'll put this in the show notes. So it is growing, and different people are using this, working with this in different ways. And it's very alive and very dynamic and popping off in all sorts of different directions
Mm.
that are hugely productive. So yeah, it's got a lot. There's a lot of energy in this that's
Yeah.
sparking.
Yeah, I look forward to learning more. And I'm wondering if maybe we need another focusing step to embrace this.
Maybe we do. Yeah, great talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
No, that's been super. That's
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this, and yeah, it's really sort of unexpectedly enlivened me. I appreciate that. Thank you.
lovely. Thank you. That's been exciting.
Yeah, good. Okay. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah. Bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye.